Most of us think we know the foundations of capitalism. Free markets, minimal government. The idea that if everyone pursued their own self-interest, society would miraculously improve. But if you ask where this idea came from, everyone cries out the same name. Adam Smith, the wig-wearing man, the father of economics, the prophet of laissez-faire. But the interesting thing is, Adam Smith never believed in the understanding of capitalism that we see referenced today. In fact, his idolization was done precisely by the very sectors he warned us against. Let me start by saying, before moving on to the invisible hand metaphor, we should look at what Smith actually advocated. Most people have never heard of it, and that's not their fault. In the last century, a myth has been built around Smith's name to such an extent that it now sounds like common sense. The story goes, the state shouldn't interfere in the economy, markets should operate freely, and competition will bring prosperity to everyone. This idea is called laissez-faire, a French term meaning let them do as they please, and it's said that Adam Smith invented it. What a beautiful, pristine, ideological story, isn't it? But there's a small problem. Adam Smith didn't say any of this. Not at all. In fact, if he were to see what modern capitalism calls the free market, he would probably ask, who rewrote my book and removed all the warnings? So let's return to Adam Smith, not in slogans, but in the real world he lived in. Smith was born in Scotland in 1723, in a society of harsh winters, limited opportunities, and where lineage was more important than talent. Britain at that time wasn't a land of free markets, but a mercantilist empire. Trade was controlled by royal monopolies, prices by guilds and industries by cartels. There were massive structures like the East India Company, with private armies acting more like states than corporations. This was the world Smith studied, a world where economic power and political power were intertwined, where markets were shaped and often manipulated by private interests. Smith actually spent much of his life warning that if merchants gain too much power, they will use it to bend the rules to their advantage. He wrote that any community of people doing the same work eventually becomes a conspiracy against the public. In other words, when businessmen come together, society loses. This is precisely the motto of unregulated capitalism. Another often overlooked fact. Adam Smith wasn't trained as an economist, nor did he even consider himself one. He was a moral philosopher. He studied human behavior, empathy, sympathy, and the psychology of treating or not treating each other fairly. Long before The Wealth of Nations, he wrote The Theory of Moral Sentiments, a profound philosophical work on human morality. Reading that book will show you. According to Smith, societies only function when people act with a certain sense of decorum and mutual responsibility. The world is run by morality, not greed. This brings us to the greatest distortion in Smith's legacy, the invisible hand, a term everyone is familiar with, even if they don't know its origin. The idea that the market, left to its own devices, will lead society to a better outcome. But here's the part modern capitalism loves to bury. Smith used this phrase only 3 times in all his writings. 3. And none of those uses describe a universal law of markets. None of them say, let corporations run free, and everything will correct itself. None of them say, deregulation is the path to prosperity. So if the idea of the invisible hand wasn't central to Smith's philosophy, what was? His belief was that the economy would only function when power was distributed and rules were enforced. He supported state intervention in education, banking, public works, natural monopolies, infrastructure, and preventing corporations from taking over the state. He believed in regulation, not just foolish regulation. He wrote page after page of warnings about corporations becoming too powerful, too politicized, and too entrenched. Smith's world was dominated by the East India Company, a vast monopoly controlling lands, armies, and trade routes. Smith called it a bloody monopoly, a destructive force that distorted markets and corrupted governments. If he were alive today, I think he would look at some of the modern tech giants, pharmaceutical holdings, and financial institutions and ask, has no one read the book? The strange and somewhat darkly comical aspect of all this is that it has become the mascot of an ideology that Adam Smith so clearly warned against. It's an intellectual fraud, like a corporation stealing the identity of the man who criticized it. To understand what Adam Smith really meant, you must start with this strange fact. The invisible hand is almost entirely absent from his work. There are only 3 uses, one in the famous The Wealth of Nations, one in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, and another in a youthful essay on the history of astronomy. And none of them mention markets correcting themselves. Let me summarize. The first relates to a kind of superstition, the tendency of people to attribute inexplicable events to the gods. The second describes a merchant who, fearing the risks of foreign trade, invests domestically out of fear. This inadvertently benefits local industry, a public benefit unintentionally created by fear. The third speaks to the physical limits of greed.
A wealthy landowner might own 10,000 acres but can only afford one dinner. Therefore, the poor survive on his leftovers. This is the moral invisible hand. The rich mistakenly feed the poor because of the limits of greed. In short, Smith's three invisible hands: superstition, fear, and the physical limits of greed don't resemble the holy trinity of neoliberal economics at all. However, in the 20th century, this small metaphor began to live a life of its own. Chicago school economists, Reagan-era politicians, and corporate lobbyists turned it into a doctrine. The invisible hand ceased to be a metaphor and became a tool used to generate arguments against the rules. During the Cold War, it was stripped of all its nuances and transformed into a moral narrative to be used against communism. Yet, what Smith actually feared was precisely what the 20th century had created: giant corporations that could set prices, influence laws, and overshadow nations. He warned that if left to their own devices, merchants could deceive and exploit the public, and that monopolies would destroy competition. He argued that governments should intervene to prevent market distortions, protect workers, and ensure justice. But those who hail Smith as a hero have ignored these aspects. Their Smith was simplified, sterilized, and stripped of its moral philosophy. All the warnings were erased, all the nuances removed, all the uncomfortable truths buried. Coming to the present day, the irony is almost painful. We have built an entire economic system on a single phrase Smith used 3 times, pointing to anomalies. We have ignored the hundreds of pages he wrote about everything we face today: the concentration of power, the influence of corporations over the state, markets distorted by those rich enough to write the rules. Modern capitalism has become the very creature Smith feared most. A world where market outcomes seem like fate rather than design, where a few can tilt the board so effectively. But understanding what Smith truly meant doesn't make the world darker, it makes it clearer. Because Smith viewed the economy as something human, flawed, correctable, and shaped by choices. What he actually advocated was a balanced system: markets strong enough to innovate, a state strong enough to restrain them, and societies wise enough to demand justice. Smith never promised that the invisible hand would save us. He argued that we must save ourselves. History may not repeat itself, but if you don't understand it, it will still crush you. If this has given you a new perspective, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. History has answers, and I will show you where to look.